Hello and welcome back. I'm Sean Fox and you're watching another episode of Made to Ramble. It's been a little while since my last video, but finally, here it is. This is the second in my series on learning photography, and in this episode we'll be talking about aperture mode. Aperture is the iris of the lens, which can be opened and closed to allow more or less light onto the sensor. It functions in much the same way as our own pupils do. Now, while shutter mode is all about controlling motion blur, aperture mode is all about controlling which parts of the image appear in focus. I'm sure we've all seen those portraits on Instagram with buttery smooth background blur. Using this shallow depth of field is a really effective way to ensure that our eyes are drawn to our subject matter, rather than those things which might otherwise be a distraction in the background. By manipulating our aperture, we can create an image with shallow depth of field where much of the image is out of focus, or with deep depth of field where most of the image is more or less in focus. As we'll discuss later though, depth of field is not only determined by our aperture, but also by the focal length that we choose, and also the size of our camera sensor. But for now, we'll focus on the aperture mode itself. To access the aperture mode, we shift the dial to A for aperture, and from here we're able to control our aperture with the front and the back dials, assuming that your camera has these dials. Much the same as shutter mode, the camera automatically changes the exposure settings to keep the image properly exposed. In other words, we can focus exclusively on how our aperture choices affect the image, without having to worry about shutter or ISO. This can be pretty convenient if you're only just starting out and you want to experiment with depth of field, but it could also be pretty handy for professional wedding and landscape photographers. You don't have to be inexperienced to use this setting. It just gives you a few less things to think about so that you can better concentrate on composing your image. So with that out of the way, let's head down the road to Mindarie Marina so I can give you a little demonstration of how aperture mode and depth of field work. Here we are at Mindarie Marina in the northern suburbs of Perth, and I thought this might be a cool spot to come in order to demonstrate what we mean when we talk about depth of field. What we're really talking about is how much of our image is in focus and how much is blurry and out of focus. Generally speaking, the wider the aperture, the smaller the area in focus is going to be within your image. Meaning that if you want more of the image to be in focus, you need to close the aperture right down. Take this pier jetty thing behind us here that we're looking at. With the aperture wide open at f2.8, focusing on the nearby pillar here, you can see that much of the background is out of focus. Conversely, if we focus on the background, then the pillar is out of focus. If we want both the foreground and the background to be in focus, we need to close the aperture right down to a tiny, very narrow setting. In this case, we're going as far as f22. As you can see, much more of the image is in focus. Now, I probably should mention that the aperture is not the only thing that has an influence on depth of field. The size of your sensor also plays a huge part. If you're using a mobile phone or a compact camera, more of your image will be in focus regardless of what aperture you choose. Focal length also plays a part in your depth of field. The more zoomed in you are, the smaller the in focus area of your image is going to be. Having a deep depth of field, meaning that more of the image in focus, is generally preferable for landscape photography, while portrait photographers tend to prefer a shallower depth of field, where much of the background is out of focus, so that there is less to distract from the main subject, the person, of course, that you're taking a photo of. You would expect, therefore, that landscape photographers would stick to the smallest possible aperture at all times so that they can keep everything in focus. But unfortunately, if the photographer wants as much detail as possible in the image, then one has to also consider diffraction. I'm not entirely sure how to explain what diffraction is or why it happens. You may want to jump onto Google and do a little homework for yourself on that one. But essentially what it means is that with all lenses, there's kind of a sweet spot where you have maximum sharpness and detail. And once you drop down the aperture too much, you start to noticeably lose some of your sharpness. For this reason, most landscape photographers prefer an aperture around f8 and never really drop much below f12. Another point worth considering when using a narrow aperture is that you are more likely to see dust spots and dirt on your lens and sensor. So using f22 will often mean doing a lot more cleanup of your photos during the editing process. Of course, depending on lighting conditions and what the photo is that you're trying to take, this isn't always a deal breaker. Sometimes you don't have much of a choice. You've just got to work with what you've got. That said, there are some alternatives to keep in mind. Many landscape photographers will use Photoshop to blend several images together to achieve maximum focus on the foreground and background. This means that you don't have to compromise image sharpness. This technique is called focus stacking and is probably a subject better left to another episode. One last thing to mention here when it comes to landscape photography and depth of field is something called hyperfocal distance. Rather than blending images in Photoshop, many landscape photographers will instead choose to focus on something which is neither in the foreground or the background, but usually somewhere around a third of the way into the image. This is not necessarily the best option for creating the sharpest possible image, but it allows for most of the image to be mostly in focus. And there are a lot of really awesome professional landscape photographers for whom this is perfectly adequate. So this might be something that you'd like to experiment with. So now with the landscape photography stuff out of the way, let's talk about how focal length affects the depth of field. And to demonstrate this, I have my youngest son, Lachlan, here, who has kindly and begrudgingly volunteered to leave behind his PS4 for 5 minutes and be a model for me. So thank you very much for that, Lachlan. Although strictly speaking this isn't about aperture mode, it is about depth of field. I figured it was worth comparing how different the depth of field looks with different focal lengths. It's also probably worth noting how different people's faces look at different focal lengths. I think this is really important to understand if you're interested in learning to do portraiture. The lenses that I'm using here have different maximum apertures, so in order to make a comparison like for like, I'm setting them all at f2.8. Okay, so paying attention to the amount of background blur that you can see in these photos, there's not a whole lot of difference between 21mm and this 28mm. But switching over to the 50mm lens, and I'm pretty sure you'll notice a major difference. Take a look at that. But even more so at 90mm, the background is buttery smooth. You can also see how much more flattering the facial features are with a telephoto lens. So with that, let's head back to the house. All right. I hope this video has been informative. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that needs clarifying. I'm hoping next week I can get out a closer to home travel style video rather than another tech related vid. There will be a third in this series soon. That video will probably be focused on ISO and also understanding the exposure triangle. I'm not so sure I'm looking forward to putting that video together. I think that might be a bit of a challenge to explain, but nonetheless, I shall carry on and give it a try. Until then, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button down below, and if you haven't already, subscribe. I'll see you again soon.